So I am going to turn to our Saroja Warner, who will introduce our keynote speaker. But let me first introduce Saroja a little. We are so thrilled that Dr. Warner has been one of the conference co-chairs. And this, so let me tell you a little bit about her and why she's such a great fit for this. So Dr. Warner currently serves as the Director for Talent Development and Diversity at West Ed. In that position, go West Ed, she is committed to ensuring that each child experiences teaching and learning in classrooms and schools that are led by educators who are racially, culturally, and linguistically diverse and are culturally responsive. Warner credits excellent teachers at the University of Massachusetts, Boston for helping her develop a passion for history and eventually leading to a career in education. She started her career as a history teacher in the district she'd attended as a K-12 student. And since then, she's a national board certified teacher, received a PhD from the University of Maryland, and teaches in the teacher preparation programs there. She has extended her reach to the state and national policy arena through work at CCSSO, the Maryland State Department of Education, and AACTE. She's a leading national expert on the research and evidence base related to culturally responsive and sustaining education, educator diversity and effectiveness, educator preparation and professional learning, and school and district improvement. So, Saroja, please, I will let you introduce our keynote. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone. I hope everyone's been enjoying the conference so far. That's my team. That's my team. Listen, let me tell you something I've learned in my career. Y'all need to have a team. You really do. So my job right now, though, is to introduce our keynote speaker. And I have to say that when Nate and I were working together, putting this conference agenda together and thinking about the conference theme and the type of programming that we wanted to make sure was front and center, it took me all of 3 seconds to call out the name Dr. Ivory Toldson. Because if there's anyone whose work epitomizes the conference theme and I think the conversations and issues that we're trying to provoke in the minds and work of researchers this week, it's his work. Dr. Ivory Toldson is the National Director of Education, Innovation, and Research for the NAACP. He's a professor of counseling psychology at Howard University and editor-in-chief of the Journal of Negro Education. Under the administration of former President Barack Obama, Dr. Toldson was appointed by Barack Obama to devise national strategies to sustain and expand federal support to historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs, as the executive director of the White House Initiative on HBCUs. He's also served as the president and CEO of the QEM Network. One of the greatest contributions I also think that Ivory makes is he stands up, he's smart, he knows what he's talking about, and he looks like me. And that's so very important for researchers of color, for the third grader that doesn't even know yet he or she wants to be a researcher of color. And every time I get an opportunity to hear Ivory speak, I continue to be inspired and influenced, encouraged, and confident that I too belong in this space and that I can say the things that I want to say. His latest book, which I encourage you to check it out if you haven't yet, No BS. BS means bad stats. Black people need people who believe in Black people enough to not believe every bad thing they hear about Black people. Let me say that one more time, because I think it's like after the colon, right? No bad stats. Black people need people who believe in Black people enough not to believe every bad thing they hear about Black people. Ivory, come on up and talk to these folks. Thank you.
Well, good morning. Thank you so much for such a warm introduction, Dr. Warner. It's quite an honor for me to be here, and thank you all for allowing me to be in this space. I've read the program, and I know I've read a little bit about your backgrounds, and I know a lot of you all had some affiliation with IES, where I've served as a researcher a few times. I know the rigor that it takes to be involved with that particular project. And for you all to decide that you all wanted to devote a conference to looking at racial justice is something that is really affirming to me. So thank you all for doing this, and thank you all for allowing me to be the keynote. So one of the things that Saroja said about me is that she said I was smart, and I'm not going to dispute that. But there was a time when I didn't feel very smart, and I think back to my 4th grade year, and that's the same grade that my son is in right now. But I was designated as a slow learner. I was placed in a slow learning group, and that was based on the observation of a teacher who said that I wasn't keeping up with the rest of the class. And so I remember being segregated into a smaller section, and I had a textbook that was smaller than the rest of my class. And that was the first time I saw that demarcation between me and my peers, and it felt very unsettling to me. Now, I do remember I had a very difficult time keeping up in class. I was, probably what you would call ADHD now, even though that term wasn't as pervasive back then. But I used to drift off a lot. I used to daydream. I used to like to look at ceilings a lot. The ceiling would always have a story to me. So I would look at, the dots in the ceiling and wonder how many dots there were. I would look at light fixtures. I would look at the lights that was on and the lights that was off, and just drift off on that. But another very peculiar thing I used to do was when I was supposed to be learning math, I would create stories out of the numbers. So every number had a gender and personality characteristics. So number 1 was a baby girl, number 2 was a little boy, number 3 was a boy, number 4 was a girl, number 5 was an older boy, number 6 was a adolescent girl, number 7 was a teenage girl, number 8 was a man, number 9 was a woman, and 10 was an older man. So I was a little weird kid, right? And all the numbers had relationships with each other, like one number might have been another number's mother or father, and so I would make up these stories. So that made it difficult for me to keep up with my math instruction because I was drifting off in this way. Now, interesting, decades later, and after trying to, force myself into thinking the way that I need to think in order to just survive education, education was about survival to me. It wasn't just purely learning, but it was, getting older and trying to navigate the system and trying to use things like charm and charisma to get through different situations in education, because the normal process in which education was given to me, fed to me, didn't really fit well with my particular learning style. But now I see that I was right back then. Numbers are people, and it's our ability to see numbers as people that's where we need to be in order to avoid some of the racism that is inherent within our profession as researchers. When you don't connect numbers to people, you tend to use numbers as a proxy for people, and you can insult the numbers, you can pity the numbers, you can treat the numbers all types of ways that you may not treat people. And I think I should test this. All right, thank you. All right, so when W.B. Du Bois was doing his research back in the late 1800s, He developed a particular style of research that was very authentic, where he moved into the neighborhood in Philadelphia where he wanted to understand the community. He talked to the community, he went door to door, and many of the things that he did paved the way for some of the more progressive research techniques we use right now. So things like GIS mapping. He did GIS mapping when you didn't have computers, when he had to take a physical map and then go door to door and then do coding, do geocoding on that map manually. He did what we would now call community participatory research, where he actually involved himself in the community. And he understood that in order to really do good research, and in order to really understand the population that he was researching, he had to delve deeper and not just look at them from a distance. When we conduct our own research, there's some very important aspects of it that we need to acknowledge. In my book, No BS, BS for Bad Stats, subtitle, Black People Need People Who Believe in Black People Enough Not to Believe Every Bad Thing They Hear About Black People. I had to practice that a while to say it that fast. But I proposed this model in the book to try to move towards our unintentional and sometimes intentional use of the BS. When we think about education and the research that we produce theoretically to improve education, we have to, and when I thought about this model, I thought about the computer concept of garbage in, garbage out. So when you put garbage into the system, you get garbage out of the system. A lot of research, a lot of educational research is, and just to be blunt, is garbage. And you're putting that garbage into the system. And I'm going to give some specific examples of that. But when you're trying to move towards a more authentic way of doing educational research, the first thing you have to have is good data. So good data is not memeified data. It's not data that's a quick soundbite that is presented either without context or with a context that's formulated by someone's bias. It's comprehensive data that you can analyze a lot of different ways. You can look at it longitudinally. You can have different perspectives on it, and you can really use it for good. The second thing that's important is a thoughtful analysis. Thoughtful analysis is where you really look deeply into the data. It's not just this comparative type research, and I'm going to give some examples of that also, using within group analysis and compassionate understanding. That's when you're social justice oriented with your understanding. That's when you're humanistic in your understanding. And if you see something that looks negative on the surface, you delve deeper to really try to find the meaning of it. So the first time I understood why it was important for us to connect people with numbers was probably when I was doing a series of reports for the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation called the Breaking Barriers. I titled it the Breaking Barriers Report. And this was looking at the achievement of Black males. Now, when I started that endeavor, there was a lot of research that was coming out about the dire state of Black men in education, Black males in education, Black boys in particular, where just about every positive indicator, they were saying that Black boys were at the bottom of it, and every negative indicator, they were at the top. And so when I was with the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, I was assigned the task of doing some research to further examine that topic. Now, when I first started this research project, I probably approached it like any other researcher, where I was looking for gaps. I was trying to identify areas where Black boys were not doing well and then perhaps opine about why they may not be doing well or how they could do better. But at the same time, and this is just through happenstance, I was asked by someone, an author in South Carolina, who started a writing project for young black males, for black boys who were in 8th and 10th grade. Those were the grades that she targeted. She wanted a middle school group and a high school group. And she wanted them to tell their own story. She called it Mile in My Shoes. So she put out $200 of her own money and had this essay contest. And black boys who entered the essay contest had the opportunity to win this money. And all they had to do was write about, just share their story. So she wanted me to be a judge of the essay contest. So at the same time, I'm analyzing this data about black boys and looking at all of this archive data that I got from ICPSR, hosted at the University of Michigan. I was reading the stories of black boys. And I started to shift the way that I was looking at the data as I was reading these stories. And one of the more important things is I started to not really see much value in comparing black boys to white boys. So that whole style of where are black boys in comparison to white boys, that really didn't seem to do anything. I wasn't getting any information out of it. So I started to look at groupings of black boys instead. So I started to look at low achieving black boys versus middle and versus high, and seeing what separated the experiences of black boys who were doing well in school from those who weren't doing so well. So I remember doing an analysis of health behaviors in school-aged children, where you can look at a lot of different health characteristics. So things like sleeping, eating, and also some mental health characteristics. So there was so much in it that I decided to do a stepwise multiple regression analysis to see which factors had the strongest association with doing well in school. And so when I did the analysis, there were 3 factors that rose up to the top. 3 health factors that seemed to explain most of the variance when it came to whether or not a black boy was doing well in school. And those 3 were quality of life. So quality of life was measured with a question, how good do you feel about your life at present? And so those black boys who said that they felt very happy about their life, using that word happy, they were the most likely to be doing well in school. So happiness appeared to be kind of this G factor. That made sense to me. The third one was feeling lonely. So that's kind of associated with happiness. And then the second one was the one that kind of threw me for a loop. The second one was a variable or an item called tired in the morning. And it asked the question, how often do you feel tired when you're going to school in the morning? And the response choices was rarely, if ever, to almost every day. And so those black boys who were often tired in the morning did worse in school. And so I was trying to figure out, more about that. And I remember talking to one of my colleagues out there, Leon Caldwell, who was at University of Memphis at the time. And he said, yeah, that makes perfect sense. In fact, I'm doing a research study on that right now, looking at the association between sleep deprivation and the misdiagnosis of ADHD. And so I was like, tell me more about that. And he said, well, think about it. Think about when you go to the conferences and you stay up too late the night before, and you're chatting it up at the hotel bar, and then you get up early in the morning for a keynote session. How do you behave? So I had to concede. I might need to take a few more breaks, and might need to slap myself a little bit, may need to stand up, may need to take a psychoactive stimulant like Ritalin or coffee to make my way through it. And then I read in one of the essays, A Mile in My Shoes essay from someone named William, what was his first name? Okay, I guess that's not important. His last name was Bunkley. I was about to say William Bunkley, but I don't think that's it. so, so I read in his essay, he said, I think sometimes we don't get enough sleep and can't stay up during class, which affects how much information you get from the teacher. From that, you don't take very good notes. Then you study the wrong information. Now you have to take a test and get a bad grade. Then that gives people further reason to believe that we are dumb and don't know anything. So he basically broke down this entire system, and he went well beyond just the association of not getting enough sleep and not doing well in school, but he took it even further to the biases that he knows is out there, that he's conscious of. And he said that we are dumb and don't know anything. He didn't say I, so he was conscious that as a Black boy, people are looking for reasons. That gives people further reason to believe that we are dumb and don't know anything. So it was that voice that really helped me to understand my own data better. And with these kids' permission, I took a lot of those quotes and included it in my Breaking Barriers report because I felt like the numbers and the data that I was producing in that report would be incomplete if I didn't have their voices. So that's why it's very important for us to include the voices of people. One of the principles that I teach in the book is that we should not use numbers to understand people. We should use people to understand numbers. So when you derive of a statistic, that doesn't mean you know more about that population. That means that you have a conversation starter. You have a way to start to have the proper conversations about what you found. So let's talk about racism in research, because a lot of times we don't really think about it. And I think there are researchers that think that our profession is immune from racism because of this, because we've talked ourselves into believing that our research is objective, right? Even though we have hypotheses for our research, and we're taught that a hypothesis is an educated guess, and there's nothing objective about a guess, right? But we say that it's objective. Now, let me talk about some of the more subtle things, and these are some experiences I've had. I remember being a junior faculty member at a conference in Baltimore. This is a conference where there were very few people who looked like me at the conference, kind of like this conference. So I'm in a session, and someone is illustrating a relationship between age and being a victim of violence. Just a simple correlation between the two. This was data that he got from Baltimore. So essentially what the data represented was that the older the child was, the more likely that they would be a victim of violence. So that's, not rocket science. But he was really trying to illustrate a visualization of data. So it wasn't the data in of itself, it was this visualization. And so there was this balloon effect that he presented with that data. And then so he showed the balloon that illustrated the increased likelihood that a child would be a victim of violence as they got older. And he showed the balloon effect. And then he said, that was pretty cool. Let's do it again. And so he rewinded and then did the balloon effect again. And everybody started laughing. Now I'm sitting there thinking, we're laughing. Or they're laughing. I wasn't laughing. But they're laughing at kids in Baltimore being victimized because they have separated the data from the people. So the data just becomes this visual effect that they're playing with, and they can laugh about it. But those kids who are victims of violence, they're not laughing. I remember being at the University of Michigan, one of my favorite white universities. I was taking a training. I'm not being sarcastic. It is one of my favorite white universities. I got a lot of training from University of Michigan, but I was taking a training, and we were learning how to analyze the American Community Survey using some tools that had been developed at the University of Michigan. And there was someone from Georgia State University that seemed to know more than everybody else in the training, but he was in the training himself. He was like looking over everybody's shoulder, acting like he was like a teacher's assistant when I never saw him be assigned as teacher's assistant. But I remember he came over my shoulder and he saw me doing racial comparisons. And whatever I was analyzing at that time, I didn't see a significant difference between the white and the black population. And he said, I bet if you did it this way instead of that way, you'd find what you're looking for. And my response was, how do you know what I'm looking for? This is kind of the way we think when we do research. It's our choice whether to run an analysis again or whether to second guess what we found. It's our choice whether to add control variables and things like that. And oftentimes, when we don't find a problem with Black people, we think we've done something wrong. But if we don't find a problem with white people, we think we've done things right. So it's these biases, that's a form of racism that creeps into our research. Now let me give some more real world consequences of some of the ways in which we conduct research. How many of y'all have heard of the super predator? Okay, so just about everybody's heard of the super predator, especially since it crept into the 2020 election. How many of y'all have heard of John DiIulio at University of Pennsylvania? Okay, a few of you have. Is John DiIulio in the room? Okay. All right, so he was one of the researchers, him along with John Fox, coined the term super predator in the 1990s. In the 1990s, that was the late 80s, early 90s, still remains the peak of violence in the Black community. And so during that time, there was a lot of researchers out there that were conducting analysis and trying to understand why there was so much violence, but also giving these projections of what would happen if we didn't control it. And so that's where they coined the term super predator, which didn't represent the people by their research. It didn't represent the people who were committing the crimes at that time per se. It was a prediction of where we were headed. So it was the coming of the super predator. And so he did these analyses where they looked at the escalation of violence over time and predicted that it would continue to escalate in the same way. And they also looked at demographic shifts. So they saw that the white population, or white people's share of the population was declining, and people of color's share of the population was increasing. And so looking at the disproportionate rate of crime among communities of color, and then expecting the nation to be more diverse, they presented that as this thing that was threatening our nation, because you would have these super predators that would be running rampant in the streets. This is supposed to be objective research, but this is what John DiIulio said in an article that he wrote on the coming of the super predator. He said, on the horizon are tens of thousands of severely morally impoverished juvenile super predators. They are perfectly capable of committing the most heinous acts of physical violence for the most trivial reasons. They fear neither the stigma of arrest nor the pain of imprisonment. They live by the meanest code of the meanest streets, a code that reinforces rather than restrains their violent hair trigger mentality. In prison or out, the things that super predators get by their crime, their criminal behavior, is sex, drugs, money, These are their own immediate rewards. Nothing else matters to them. So far as their youthful energies hold out, they will do what comes naturally: murder, rape, rob, assault, burglarize, deal deadly drugs, and get high. 1995. Ivy League professor. This is supposed to be based on his objective research. Is this racist? Hell yeah, right? But it's a racism that he could hide behind data with. Now, John DiIulio, he did have a come to Jesus moment, quite literally, actually. He started to, and this came after he was proven wrong, because many of you all know that crime rate kind of plummeted in the late 1990s and then continued on through the 2000s. So by early 2000s, it was clear that the super predator that he predicted, which would have made gentrification completely untenable, it was clear that he was wrong, and so he had to deal with him, with the flaws in his data. And so he said that he was no longer doing those types of analysis. He conceded that he was wrong, and he also said that he found Jesus, and he said that, and he was a conservative. He was a Republican, and so he wrote a book called the Godly Republican, where he said that we should be connecting to people, and that we should look at the humanity of people and all that kind of stuff. But this is after he had a tour telling all of these politicians what I just read to you, and claiming that we need to have tougher laws in terms of mandatory minimum sentencing, trying children as adults, especially the trying children as adults. He went hard in the paint on that. So these are some of the things that happen. Now, generally, and what he did was the most egregious, but generally, when you examine the research that was conducted during that time when we had this high crime rate in the Black community, and the subsequent period where it reduced tremendously, there was a lot of social scientists that were talking about why the crime reduced. Now, these are some of the more common explanations, the more common sociological explanations about why violence reduced in the 90s. So one was the economic boom. It was Clintonomics helped to reduce the violence. Another one was the tough on crime laws. So because we had the mandatory minimum sentencing, and because we had all this draconian enforcement, that's what brought it down. Another explanation is the declining price of crack. Because the value and the price of crack went down, it made it less lucrative as a profession, and so that reduced the violence. And then one of the more crazy and far out ones, and you could look at Freakonomics that came out of University of Chicago. Forget the author. Great book, but I think he was off with this. But he said that it was abortions becoming legal. That abortions becoming legal in the 70s reduced the would-be criminals in the population. So these are major sociological, and I'm going to go ahead and say blunt, these are white explanations. These are white explanations of why the crime decreased. Now, I grew up in that era. So, I had friends that became crack dealers. I saw what crack was doing to the Black community, and I saw a lot of my friends go to jail. And I also saw the things that Black people were doing at the same time. So if you ask me, why did the crime decrease? The reasons I would give is there was a rise of consciousness in the Black community, and you can see that through certain songs that came out during that time. How many of y'all remember the song, We're All in the Same Gang? A couple of Black people raised their hand. Okay, all right. How many of y'all remember Self-Destruction? Self-destruction, you're headed for self-destruction. Right. Okay, so That didn't make it into the analysis. But clearly, you had Black people at the time trying to control this. Other things, you had more community-based centers that started during that time. You had gang truth that happened during that time. There was gun buyback programs. There was community-based anti-violence and violence prevention programs. There was popular Black programming that started on TV, like A Different World. There was the popularization of conscious hip hop happened around that time. So you had people like Public Enemy and X-Clan. You also had just general, that's also when Afrocentricity started in the 90s, where people was wearing African medallions and things like that. So there was a lot of things that was happening that could plausibly explain why crime reduced, but somehow it missed our research. Let's talk about education research. So there's a lot of racism in education research. And when we think about things like achievement and the way that we talk about the achievement gap, it's framed in a way that is racist. It's framed in a way that normalizes whiteness, that treats the gap between white and Black much different than we treat any gaps between white and Asian, because we have normalized the group that has the most power. And it's been described in such a way that gives power to certain groups and takes away power from others. Achievement has always been a word that resonated with me well. Like I like the way that sounds, when someone says, you've achieved. When you think about an achievement, it's something that makes children so proud. But when you ask a group of teachers right now, what is achievement, you get some really clumsy answers. Like, because of our research, they don't even know how to answer the question, what is achievement? When you take the restraints off of them, so forget about the research, forget about the achievement test, forget about achievement gaps and all the things you've heard, what does achievement mean to you? Then you get some more authentic answers. They'll talk about, reaching your goals. They'll talk about, fighting and being creative and not letting anybody hold you back. All the things that we want them to understand about achievement if they're going to help their students to achieve. When we think about achievement as it's used, achievement and achievement gap is a social construct. So there's a personal meaning that we have of achievement, but we've tried to normalize it. Oh, goodness, sorry. Trying to wake y'all up. But we've tried to standardize achievement in such a way that has reduced its power. What you see on the screen is two different conceptions of achievement and the achievement gap. So we've been conditioned to do what you see on your left-hand side. Take one group, compare it to another, and then as long as those lines are coming closer together, then we pat ourselves on the back and say that we're doing a good job. But that doesn't work, because that's not how achievement works. When we think about our own pathway to achievement, it looks a lot more like what you see on the right-hand side. It's not comparative, but it's relative. It's not linear, it's dynamic. And it's not fixed, but it's complex. And any comparison, and you see the dashed line in the backdrop, but any comparison is just to understand the effects of oppression and racism. when we think about how a lot of things are used in the educational system, it doesn't help us to grow. And to give you one more example of racism in educational research and the education system in general. So we look at these reading tests. So we could look at the NAEP examination. We could look at any state examinations on whether or not a student can read. Now, I can get into all of the flaws in a lot of that. There's been examinations that's done on third grade reading tests and taking it through the same system that journalists use to see whether or not something's at an eighth grade level, because that's what they like to print. And a lot of things that we have third graders reading are actually at a high school level, but we're using that to determine whether or not they could read. But I remember being at a conference and there was a panel and there was a Black principal who said that 100% of her students in her high school, 100%, were not reading on grade level. And there was an audible gasp. And a lot of people felt sorry for her because she was teaching all of these non-reading kids. And then somebody else gave the BS line, the bad stats line, that prison beds are built because of reading scores. So basically, they were kind of predicting or prognosticating that she would have a lot of criminals in her school because you had all these kids who weren't reading on grade level. Students who were just like me, because I wasn't reading on grade level based on an assessment back then. Probably not now either. I'm too creative to do well on those tests. So that's the meaning that she had to that. So let me talk about what it meant technically that 100% of her students weren't reading on grade level. So this is a technical meaning. On a national or state assessment of reading, the students achieved a score that was less than the scores achieved by the norm reference group of students in the same grade. The calculated score is an estimate that reflects both the actual reading ability and random error, such as motivation, fatigue, resentment, attention deficits. And the unknown true score lies within a range of confidence, which varies based on the validity of the assessment and the testing circumstances. It also means that some students who are not reading on level are missing basic level abilities to recognize and express words and understand the meaning of words. However, this is best assessed through oral reading, not silent examinations. These students will need extra care and attention to learn concepts they should have learned in previous grades. But many other students who are not reading on grade level have scores that are marred with error. They could care less about the test, and honestly, why should they? They didn't sleep the night before. They don't like the educator. They see through the con, which is they know that they want you to do well for them and not for you. Or they have attention deficits, which should be assessed independently of the reading examination. So these students need social support, inspiration to be re-engaged in school, more agency over what they read and how they read it, and they need to know the educator actually cares about them. So this is what it means. It doesn't mean that you have budding criminals. It means that you have students who either need some extra support to read or need extra support to be able to come in contact and embrace their own love of reading. So we need to have a better relationship to the research that we're doing. So as I draw to a conclusion, I want to share some principles that I think is important for us to have when we're avoiding anti-Black racism in research. The first thing we need to do is to understand our positionality, privilege, and subjective limitations when writing about Black communities. Now, this is for everybody, not just white researchers, but Black researchers too. There are certain advantages that I might have in researching Black communities in that I grew up in one. And we also have to acknowledge those advantages, because traditional ways in which we talk about research will cite that as a disadvantage because it gives me some subjective limitations. And I want to say that that's BS. Not bad stats, just BS. The second thing is we have to understand and acknowledge the role of white privilege and global white supremacy when framing problems within the Black community. These problems didn't just pop up out of nowhere. So if you don't have the proper frame and context for the problem, then you're not going to generate good research. Third, you have to state explicitly how Black people would tangibly benefit from these research findings. We should not be conducting research just for the sake of research or conducting research just to problematize. We also have to conduct research on Black humans and strive to convey a deeper understanding of the Black community, of the Black experience. We have to refrain from casting a spotlight on Black problems without highlighting the important work germinating from within the Black community. Go back to the example of self-destruction. We have to refrain from otherizing, and that's separating Black people from the larger context of the Black experience. And finally, we have to refrain from normalizing whiteness. Think the achievement gap. We have to stop using statistical comparisons between Black and white populations for the purpose of trying to determine how Black people should be doing. We should only use such comparisons to understand the effect of racism. So, I want to give one final anecdote as I draw this to a conclusion. I was looking at a docuseries on Pablo Picasso. And one of the more interesting parts of that docuseries, Pablo Picasso was trained under the classical European style of art. And so it was this portrait type art that looked very true to life. But he wasn't satisfied with his work. And so he saw the work of Matisse and he became enamored with it. One day he went to an art show and he had his work and he saw Matisse with his work displayed, and he felt so dissatisfied with his own work that he decided to pack up and leave and not display his work because he didn't want it next to Matisse. And so one of his friends tried to cheer him up and said, you shouldn't be checking for Matisse, because he didn't use the word checking. I don't think they were saying that in Spain back then. But he said, you shouldn't be checking for Matisse because look how he's being slammed in this major publication. So Picasso went on to read what this major publication was saying about Matisse just slamming his work, and Picasso slammed the paper down, pointed to it, and said, I want people like that to say things like that about my work. So then he finally got a chance to meet Matisse. He told Matisse about the admiration that he had for him. And so the first thing Matisse did was gave him an African sculpture. And he said, this is where I draw my inspiration from. He said, these European artists, they only do what photographers can do better. He said, Africans aren't painting our lives, they're painting our dreams. And so from that conversation, Picasso started to change his style. And his style became the style that we all know and can recognize today. But the African influences of that style permeates. When we think about our research and we think about this style of research that we have that's so far removed from W.E.B. Du Bois's research, and we think about where we should be going, just like Picasso did, where he drew inspiration from Africa, and we might say appropriate, but that's a different debate. But we'll just say drew inspiration at this point. Our research is incomplete if we don't really pull from the talents of the communities that we're researching. Numbers are people. Behind every number, there is a person. Behind every person, there is a story. Behind every story, there is a solution. The way I begin my book, No BS, which will be on sale after this presentation for a discounted price. But I begin the book by saying, soul food didn't come from emulating white cooks. Jazz, rock and roll, and hip hop didn't come from emulating white musicians. And good research on Black people won't come from emulating white scholars. I cook my research in a rusty pot with lots of spice and serve it ostentatiously on 2 turntables and a mixer. You can acquire a taste for my tone or let it offend your useless sensibilities. I'm gonna be steadfast with my hustle until you start emulating me. Thank you.
Hello. Yeah, there we go. Oh, Ivory, thank you so much. Y'all, we got to give it up again. So we have some time for some questions that we're going to ask people. If you have any questions you want to ask, there are microphones on the 2 sides of the room here. Please just feel free to step up. You can even step up and just make a comment about something that resonated with you that Dr. Toldson talked about today.
And this actually comes from a comment you made. It comes from a teacher's perspective. Because as someone who spent the majority of her time as a teacher and is now moving out of the classroom, we find ourselves in the position of kind of being the tools of the people in a position of power.
Right.
So you made a comment about achievement. As educators in the classroom, we quite often don't view achievement as that test score.
Right.
But we have to base our livelihood on getting these children to this particular test score when we know that that is not an accurate measurement of anyone's achievement, even white students. It's just not.
Yeah.
So what kind of direction would you point someone in, especially if you're in the classroom, of how they could become one of the tools rather than perpetuating this particular power disparity? What could a teacher do? What could you direct them to? What sort of research, and where they could then come back and say, hey, this isn't the right way to be measuring these kids?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I wish I could give you another presentation, another hour to answer that. But these were questions that we addressed in a think tank that I sponsored, or that I hosted, that was sponsored by the National Science Foundation. The white paper that I produced is on the National Science Foundation's website. And what it was looking at the future of education. So I think that the answer to your question of what needs to happen, so I think it's humanistic distributed agency. That's what I think we should. And you're like, what the hell is that? So when we think about education in this country, we could think about different eras of education. And race has been in the backdrop of every era. So we can think about the segregation era, then the post-Brown versus Board of Education integration era, where there was an attempt to force integration that didn't work out so well. We still had de facto segregation, and it really changed the complexion of a lot of different cities. And then after that, we had the reform era. That's the era that we're in right now. That started around the 1990s when we gave up on integration as a primary objective, and so standardization became what we were striving to do. So the reform era, which is where achievement gap and standardization and all the things that we know right now in terms of how to improve education, that's been with us for over 30 years now. Now, when I talk to different groups, whether it be researchers or teachers, everyone agrees that the reform era has outlived its usefulness, and it's time for us to bring in a new era of education. The new era of education that I think needs to happen is an era that decentralizes the power in education. So right now we have this hierarchical apex-like system where we have someone or some entity at the top. If we look at it from a district level, we'll see the superintendent at the top. If we look at it from a school level, the principal is at the top, but the principal is answering back up. But it's this hierarchical thing where the people at the top make all the decisions, and it gets handed down into what we might consider best practices, or standardization of practices. So that means all the teachers are supposed to be doing the same things, even though they're working with different students. And it also means that the ones who are the furthest away from the students are making all decisions, and the ones that are closest to the students, including the students themselves, have the least power. So the answer to that is the same answer that came when people became suspicious of the central banks. And so they decided to start an alternative currency that was based on distributed trust. So instead of you trusting one central body, you have a collective of people that you trust that's all built into the system. So with distributed agency, I believe that teachers should have more agency to do the things that they believe is in the best interest of the students that they teach. But in exchange for that, they need to be putting data back into the system so that we understand what's working and what's not working. So that way, instead of a standardization of practices, we have a standardization of principles. So every teacher doesn't need to do the same thing, but they need to believe in the same thing. So they all need to believe in a growth mindset, and that all students, regardless of who they are, should have the opportunity to succeed. They should all have that, and that's what we should be training. That's what we should be evaluating. So it's not what they do, it's what they believe. And then in order for us to really know what works, we need some variation. As researchers, we know that if we don't have variance, we don't have research. If we don't have research, we don't have an understanding. So if we can have some variance in the teaching profession, as opposed to standardization, then we can learn more. So the humanism part of it comes from those values that I talked about. The distributed agency part comes from computing. You all see I like to take computer principles and apply it to education system. But it's the distributed trust that can happen. It's taking the top of the pyramid and putting it in the center and changing the nature of leadership from this charismatic leader at the top to someone in the middle that's gathering information from all of this variance and then improving the system by putting out the best information based on what we learn from conscious teachers who are doing the good work.
I really appreciate your response, and I hope that's okay.
Yeah. And the article, if you could Google my name and just do distributed agency. Yeah. Google my name and distributed agency, and you should be able to see the report that's on the NSF website.
Hi. Wonderful presentation. So exciting that you're here. And I'm so excited about your question from the teacher perspective. You said bringing data back into the system.
Mhm.
And many of us in the room have expertise in what to do with the data once it's in the system.
Mhm.
But there is a small and mighty set of experts in this room who think very hard about what data is going into the system in the first place
Mhm.
and the measures that we're sort of stuck with to sort of connect to those comments.
Mhm.
What is your advice or your thinking for the people who are thinking about changing the measures we have anyway,
Mhm.
right? And how do we, on a large scale, put data back into the system that will actually illuminate what it is we're trying to understand?
Yeah, so the second part is the most important, how you put the data back into the system. The first part isn't as important because so much data is being collected already. I was shocked at how much data we collect on students when I started doing research on secondary data. I thought all we did was do the NAEP test because that's all I heard about. So the federal government does NAEP, but they also do the high school longitudinal survey. They also sponsor monitoring the future. So there's a treasure trove of data out there that where students are saying from their own perspective what works for them. And so when I was analyzing this data for the Breaking Barriers report, I was finding things like simple things, but it could be demonstrated through the data. But that students who are involved in school-based extracurricular activities were doing much better than those that weren't. And I also found that, something more nuanced, that Black males in particular, they value teachers who respected them and treated them as people over teachers that they found more knowledgeable. So you have a treasure trove of data that's out there that could be put to good use, but our perspective on what's important and what's not important, that's what needs to shift. Because if we know that extracurricular activities are important, then, and we know that from the data, then why isn't that a push? Why don't you have superintendents saying that we need to have 100% participation in extracurricular activities at the school for you to meet a certain benchmark, rather than we need you to hit a certain level on the standardized test. So as long as the standardized test drives the narrative of what's important and all of this other very important information is put off to the side, then we're going to have the issues that we have. So how do we flip it? I don't know, humanistic distributed agency. Because we're gonna have to give some power to the people who are closest to the students that can observe what they need in order for them to say, these are things that we really should be looking at. We really need to look at the relationship between the teacher and the student, not just the performance on the standardized test. But the data is there. We're just not using it.
Hi, thanks so much. Vivian Wong from University of Virginia. Thank you for your presentation. I'm inspired again by your thoughts about distributive leadership, and we've been thinking about developing and designing research studies in a more collaborative and inclusive ways. And so I was wondering if you could provide some comments about what types of structural supports do you think are needed so that hierarchies of power don't get reproduced even in these smaller groups that are distributed, right? So I have a lot of concerns that even when you walk into, a room of people where you've tried to bring in sort of diverse communities of that, in the end, sort of hierarchies of power sort of end up being reproduced, but on a smaller scale. So
Right. Yeah, that's a good question, and I kind of wish we had those problems because we have to try to figure out how to even start it to begin with. But when we think about how social media has shaped society for good and for bad, but it's made a lot of people connected that wouldn't be connected otherwise. When you think about schools, they're already educators, along with students also, who are connected through social media type structures. Some of them use some of the platforms that we know about, which I think is kind of problematic. But there's other platforms that's developed within the education system that they could all use, where they could share resources, they could talk about what's working, what's not working, and all these types of things. So that's really what distributed trust is about. So you have distributed agency, but it's also distributed trust. It's you being evaluated not just by this hierarchical structure, but being evaluated by your peers and your students. And so everyone has, just like with blockchain or with cryptocurrency, it's on this distributed ledger. And so instead of one central office validating it, it gets broken apart, distributed across thousands of different people, and everybody has a hand in saying, is this valid? And so I think that's the model that needs to be baked. But because we already have social media as a model, we know that we can connect people outside in ways that we couldn't connect them before. So the short answer to your question is it would be more of a peer process. It would be more of a teachers and students and parents looking and evaluating each other and trying to improve this system.
Thanks.
Thank you for your talk. I think some of the themes you're echoing are quite sympathetic to this group, but there's a world out there. At the end of October, a group called Students for Fair Admissions case is going to be heard before the US Supreme Court. It is challenging the admissions policies of Harvard University, where I teach, and the University of North Carolina, where there are several people in this room. If the Supreme Court rules the way we expect them to rule, test scores alone will be the only measure of achievement that can be used for higher education admission. What can you do in your work to try to influence this potential change that is going to dramatically affect education in this country for decades to come? Thank you.
Yeah. So that decision and the decision that is likely to happen will set us back a lot. And I don't have to go into why it's just really ascientific to use just a test score in order for admissions. But I do think we should talk about how we should be modernizing the way that we get information about students and determine whether or not they're ready for college. Based on my test scores and my high school GPA and all those numeric values, I would not have been able to go to even the school that I eventually went to, which was LSU, during that time. Because of the technological tools that we have right now, we really could change drastically how we look at whether or not a student is ready for college. We could have digital wallets for all the students, and for everything that they do outside of the school, they could get something in their digital wallet that says that they went to this science fair, or they went to this museum and took this tour, and all these types of things. We could be evaluating the entire package. Right now, we have some very complex college applications, but we don't use much of the material that we get from students. But we could do that in standardized tests. Why do we need scores that only tell me whether I'm doing better or worse than my peers, when they could easily get information from the students and give a personalized score that takes into account what you want to do in life, what your interests are, and all those types of things. So the report that you get back if you say you want to be a novelist might be different than the report that you get back if you said you wanted to be an astronaut. So we really do need to think bigger. The case is one thing, and the case, it really, to me, boils down to a simple issue that we should have resolved a very long time ago, and that's whether or not to use the test alone, or can we use other social factors? But we really should be modernizing the entire thing. And I think through educational research, we could come up with some very robust ways of understanding student potential outside of just the things that we're looking at right now.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I really needed it. I'm a first year UC Davis student, and I just got my master's at Teachers College, and
Congratulations.
And I got trained quantitatively there, right? Quantitative methods, and this achievement gap measurement that you brought up, really helped me challenge the way that I was trained, because as you know, the George Floyd incident caused or influenced a lot of schools to take initiative and be a little bit more race-centric. But the version of being this way was to just tell us, compare racial groups, right? And I was just very surprised that they made us just compare white versus black versus Latino, right? And I would say there's more to that, but I would get pushed back and be told, no, that's the way to do it, and that's how you're gonna find these racial inequalities. And I just wanted to comment, there's a role that professors play here in colonizing the minds of students of color.
Yes.
And I also wanted to ask, what advice do you have for students of color to just, how do you say it? Protect our minds from being colonized and uncolonize our minds.
Yeah. So that's a very good question, and I know that we're out of time, but there's no simple answer to it. It's a matter of survival, and different students have had to do different things in order to survive that system. It's great that you are thinking the way that you need to think right now, and there may, depending on the relationships that you have, depending on different dynamics, there may be some influence you have over your professors. Okay. Sometimes the dynamics in an entire department can change just because one professor comes. There may be a professor that can be your ally. There may be one professor you can influence that can go on to influence others. But knowing what's right is the most important thing. And one thing I will say is, whatever you have to do in order to survive this system, just make sure that once you get out and you have your own power, you use that to provide opportunities for students that you might not have had with the current leadership that you have there.
Thank you again, Dr. Toldson. Thank you for the questions and the engagement today. Ellen, do you want to? Another round of applause. Yeah, another round of applause.